In this video, we'll be reviewing Adam Grant's Think Again, a fascinating exploration of not just what we know, but also what it takes to unlearn and relearn what we know. Welcome to Strategy Books, introducing leaders to the books and ideas that make a difference, and most importantly, the books that can help you make a difference in the world around you. Hit the subscribe button to stay current and the bell to be notified every time there's a new video up. I'm Mark Mullally. Follow me here, and you can also connect on Twitter and Instagram at strategy_books. As always, the links to everything we discussed today can be found in the description below. So, let's get started. This is a book that I came across about a year ago. It was released in February 2020. I bought it in March, so relatively new after it was bought. And what I was struggling with as I was actually starting this review was, what was the prompt that actually led me to acquire it? And it was difficult to chase down because first off, Amazon told me I hadn't bought it through them, and I hadn't. I had actually bought it through another vendor, Indigo, instead. And apparently that was with a number of other books, a bit of a binge in terms of works around mindset and management and communication and versatility. And so this found its way onto my bookshelf, and over the course of the last couple of weeks found it in my lap as we got ready for this particular review. As I said, it was published in February 2021. It is cognizant of the events of the pandemic and actually speaks to some of the challenges around that in terms of how we trust in the scientific community, how we build credibility and are willing to think about and reframe our perspectives about what we need to do and what we need to think about and what we need to value. Adam Grant is an interesting individual. He is a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He has been the top-rated professor there for 7 years running, which is an incredible accomplishment. Although when I actually read the quality of his work, it's possibly not terribly surprising. He does a really, really great job of weaving together research and insight and storytelling in order to be able to present a really credible and really informative read. Now, Think Again is not his first work. He's actually written a number of other books. Give and Take is probably one of the ones for which he is most notable, and it has a TED Talk on the same subject. He also wrote Originals, which is one I have and which will probably appear in a review in the future. And he also wrote Option B with Sheryl Sandberg, talking about grieving and figuring out ways to be able to continue to move on as we deal with some of life's challenges. But we're here talking about Think Again. And I said, well, I'm not entirely certain the entire circumstances by which I picked it up. The fact that I did so is not terribly surprising. But what's interesting about it is being able to think about, so where does Think Again fit within the overall literature? When I bought it, the subtitle on it is The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. And my original take on it was that this is a book that is a bit of a combination of personal management, effectiveness, learning, knowledge management, and a bit of a flavor of an organizational view around that as well. And I viewed it as my take on it in terms of reading the review and particularly looking at just the front cover. Can you judge a book by its cover? I certainly did in this case. Was that it fit alongside books like Sutton and Pfeffer's The Knowing Doing Gap, which is another wonderful book that I'm actually going to probably review in a few reviews forward. We just did a different book by Pfeffer and Sutton recently, but that is certainly a classic and probably an overlooked classic that needs a little bit more love and a little bit more attention. And I thought this book kind of sat alongside it in that it's really about thinking about what we know and also considering what we don't know and thinking about how we not just learn, but also unlearn and rethink what we actually know. Now, is that everything in terms of where it fits? No, and that's what becomes very interesting. Where it fits is a bit of a complicated question. Once you've actually read it, it's not purely self-help or personal management or leadership. It's not purely about organizational change. It's not simply cultural or societal critique. It lives in a space between and about all of those things. And so that idea of, fitting in the space of learning and knowing, it borders on knowledge management, but it also borders really on personal and organizational practices and thinking about, and particularly rethinking what we know and what we understand and what we believe, and being willing to challenge and rethink and reframe what those beliefs are. So what was the author trying to do? In this book, in my view, Adam Grant was really trying to accomplish what his stated purpose was, which is about unlearning and what it takes to be able to reframe. And in the context of where we are today, we are 2 and a bit years on into a pandemic. We are struggling with a huge amount of polarization in our political spheres, and that just seems to be getting more entrenched and more dug in. This is a really relevant topic because it speaks to the idea of how do we get so entrenched and what drives that. And it's not just how do they get entrenched, thinking about that other that we might think is being irrational or unreasonable or touting unreasonable beliefs. And at this point, I'm not actually naming names or pointing fingers, because really that's kind of the dialogue and the dominant narrative that is driving so much of the news cycle right now. But where do those beliefs come from? How do they get entrenched? And if we're going to shift things, what's it going to take? Literally what's required in order to be able to do that. And this is where this becomes a very interesting book, because it starts to be able to point to promising approaches or insights or perspectives of how that dialogue could be shifted, how adjustments could be made, how new perspectives might be obtained, and how old perspectives might be abandoned, or at least step down somewhat in terms of their overall influence. And it really explores what does it take to actually then reframe those insights and reframe those perspectives. The structure of it is built upon how we rethink on multiple levels. And if this were a book that I were writing, I would probably actually take a fairly similar structure to it, because it talks about how we actually rethink and how we unlearn, first on an individual level, and then in relating to and communicating with others, and how we actually build dialogue and build meaning and build collective understanding. And then how do we do that collectively? And in particular, how do we do that in the context of organizations? So a lot of this, when we talk about the idea of collective unlearning, isn't necessarily societal unlearning, although it is there, but really within the institutions that we find ourselves most immediately operating in, i.e. the organizations that we actually work with, whether that is as leader, that is as manager, or that is person within the organization, trying to get things done as best we are able to. It provides some really interesting examples of unlearning as well. And it does that. I actually admire what he's done here. Is he definitely takes it out of stakes that are high. So we think about our current reality in terms of, again, the polarization of politics and the us versus them narrative. And it definitely sidesteps that to a very different us and them. So there's a wonderful series of explorations within the book about specifically the idea of how we become entrenched in beliefs as fans. And he's got a wonderful couple of stories there about exploration and research that he has done. He's done with research students that he is working with. Everyone being able to understand how entrenched and how committed fans of the New York Yankees versus the Boston Red Sox actually become. And that is a rivalry that is centuries old. And interestingly enough, these rivalries and the intensity of the rivalries are a product of a couple of different things. It's about proximity, the fact that New York and Boston are close. It is about capabilities of the team, the fact that there is a real level of competition and a meaningful level of competition between them, where each of them has relatively comparable talents and capabilities and has been able to sustain that over a significant period of time. They play each other about 20 times a season, 16 to 18. And at this point, they've played more than 2,200 games against each other, of which one team has won more than 1,000, as has the other. So they're well matched, but they're incredibly entrenched in terms of their fans in loyalty to their particular team. And so residents of Boston aren't just dedicated diehard Red Sox fans. They're absolutely anti New York Yankees fans. And fans of the Yankees are, again, not just entrenched in their love of the New York team, but also in their loathing of the Boston team. And so this is the framework that he starts with in terms of exploring where do these beliefs come from and how can they actually be shifted. And the really interesting thing is just trying to counter that with logic doesn't work. Trying to counter that with helping to socialize and humanize members of the other team also, interestingly enough, doesn't work. For example, experiments that have been set up where people have been prompted to get to know through a written narrative an individual person where it's revealed close to the end that they are a fan of the opposing team, or situations where a experimental subject experiences a plant falling and theoretically injuring themselves that is wearing the shirt of, again, the opposing team, and what it takes to be able to get them to be willing to help and come to their aid. And what's really interesting is that while then, humanizing that individual, making them appear similar in terms of value and beliefs, rather than taking and extrapolating, that was a nice Red Sox or Yankees fan, they all must be like that. They're taken as exceptions. But that was a really nice person. I enjoyed dealing with them, but they're not like all of the other fans. And what's really interesting is the only real way of unthinking that level of rabid loyalty is through a process of helping to have them come to terms with how irrational their beliefs actually are, by recognizing that the reason that they are rabid Red Sox fans or the reason they are rabid Yankees fans is because that is what they've always been from the product of being born in a particular place. And so it's only by imagining and being able to recognize, what if you weren't born there? What if by circumstance you were born in a different place? What would your beliefs be then? And to be able to recognize how irrational that attachment is, that not just makes them love their own team, but makes them hate the opposing team with that much more intensity. And so I want to share actually with you a bit of what Adam Grant talks about here. I err, therefore I learn. Years ago, an engineer turned management professor named Amy Edmondson became interested in preventing medical errors. She went into a hospital and surveyed its staff about the degree of psychological safety they experienced in their teams. Could they take risks without the fear of being punished? Then she collected data on the number of medical errors that each team made, tracking serious outcomes like potentially fatal doses of the wrong medication. She was surprised to find that the more psychological safety a team felt, the higher its error rates. It appeared that psychological safety could actually breed complacency. When trust runs deep in a team, people might not feel the need to question their colleagues or double-check their own work. But Edmondson soon recognized a major limitation of the data. The errors were all self-reported. To get an unbiased measure of mistakes, she sent a covered observer into the units, and when she analyzed those data, the results flipped. Psychologically safe teams reported more errors, but they actually made fewer errors. By freely admitting their mistakes, they were then able to learn what had caused them and eliminate them moving forward. In psychologically unsafe teams, people hid their mishaps to avoid penalties, which made it difficult for anyone to be able to diagnose the root causes and prevent future problems. They kept repeating the same mistakes. Since then, research on psychological safety has flourished. When I was involved in a study at Google to identify the factors that distinguish teams with high performance and well-being, the most important differentiator wasn't who was on the team or even how meaningful their work was. What mattered most was psychological safety. Over the past few years, psychological safety has become a buzzword in many workplaces. Although leaders might understand its significance, they often misunderstand exactly what it is, and particularly how to create it. Edmondson is quick to point out that psychological safety is not a matter of relaxing standards, making people comfortable, being nice and agreeable, or giving unconditional praise. It's fostering a climate of respect, trust, and openness in which people can raise concerns and suggestions without fear of reprisal. It's the foundation of a learning culture. In performance cultures, the emphasis on results often undermines psychological safety. When we see people get punished for failures and mistakes, we become worried about proving our competence and protecting our careers. We learn to engage in self-limiting behavior, biting our tongues rather than voicing questions and concerns. Sometimes that's due to power distance. We're afraid of challenging the big boss at the top. The pressure to conform to authority is real, and those who dare to deviate run the risk of backlash. In performance cultures, we also censor ourselves in the presence of experts who seem to know all the answers, especially if we lack confidence in our own expertise. And so what Grant is doing there is helping to introduce the idea of what it takes to actually be successful, not just individually, but organizationally, and some of the preconditions necessary for that. And the idea that in order to be a learning culture, and with being a learning culture and unlearning culture, we need a culture of psychological safety around that as well, and the need for that. What I love about this is the book and its relevance to me actually weaves together a number of topics that I've been in particular interested in, enthusiastic about, spending time researching, exploring, speaking about, teaching, and incorporating into my work. And so it weaves together a number of themes that matter to me, and in particular, the idea of confidence and agency. He does a really good job of introducing the idea of imposter syndrome, and also its polar opposite and twin, the Dunning-Kruger effect, the idea that those who don't know are least likely to know that they don't know, and actually are most likely to be overconfident of their abilities and skills. Whereas those who are actually well-versed in something are often the ones that are least confident in terms of their ability to be able to be effective. And the challenge that has for both sides in terms of being able to, one, be willing to actually learn what they don't know, or two, be willing to act based on appreciation that they do have more skills and capabilities and ability than they perhaps are giving themselves credit for. And so that idea of personal agency, of the willingness to be able to act, of the perception of the ability to be able to act is pretty key here. It's also about understanding value and knowledge, about seeking to understand, about continually learning, about being open to questioning and thinking and rethinking. And in doing that, being willing to challenge norms, and being willing to challenge stereotypes, be able to engage in counterfactual thinking. So similar to our Yankees and Red Sox example, what would be necessary to change our minds? What would be necessary to hold a different view? What would have had to occur in order to be able to have different beliefs than the ones that we have now? And are those factors at all things that we need to consider, factors that are in play, things that we need to confront and address? What's the degree that we could have actually held different stereotypes, and what does that actually mean for us? He also does a really good job of getting into group decision making and the, in essence, level of groupthink that we find once we actually find ourselves in a dynamic where we're interacting with others and where we avoid disagreeableness, we avoid conflict, we avoid power dynamics that may actually have an adverse impact on ourselves, on our careers, on our organizations, and therefore go along. And the idea of the emergence of group identity and building in that group identity irrational beliefs and behaviors, and then being unwilling to confront them. And so what he explores is what can actually help to turn the page, and what are the strategies that can be engaged in to be able to do that. He talks about the role of conflict, how to be able to use it constructively, and in particular the recognition that it can be constructive. But because there's a specific focus of the conflict, what we normally think about as conflict, what we normally react to, what we normally avoid, is relationship contact, is relationship conflict, is conflict with other people. And the fact that that is where we then see avoidance behaviors, unwillingness to engage, unwillingness to challenge, unwillingness to rock the boat, the idea that we are just going along to get along. Where the value comes in is in terms of task conflict, being willing to actually have opposing ideas and opposing perspectives because we have a different view of the challenges that we're facing, the obstacles that we're having to deal with, or the pathway to be able to break through those. And working to collectively try to be able to get it to be better, to be able to get to a better solution, to be able to get to a better outcome. The fact that task conflict is something that doesn't necessarily just need to be accepted. It actually needs to be encouraged. It needs to be sought out. It needs to be looked for. We need to be willing to openly disagree about the problem or the way of solving that problem in order to be able to get the best possible solution for that. And Grant brings a number of different perspectives. One of the ones I enjoyed particularly was around the relationship that existed between Orville and Wilbur Wright when they were figuring out how to be able to build a machine that could fly. And the fact that they actually had sustained, intense, heated arguments and debates that would literally go on not just days, but actual weeks. But there was a respect behind that and a willingness to be able to do that, even though for one of the brothers, it was not their normal character to be able to do that because they cared so much about what they were doing and because they cared about the outcome. And that it was the sustained willingness to be able to engage in that debate that would allow each of them to change their minds, not just to go along with what the other person was saying, but actually to go beyond what the other person was saying. They encountered, for example, a sustained conflict about how to actually be able to effectively build a propeller that would actually provide forward thrust. And this was an argument that went on for several weeks before Orville became open to the perspectives that Wilbur was speaking to, and Wilbur was open to what Orville was talking about, and there was a recognition that they were both right, but actually both wrong. And it was working through that and realizing that they actually needed two propellers moving in the opposite direction from each other. It was actually what was required in order to be able to solve the problem. It's really about how to be able to shift perspectives, to be able to open up possibilities, to be able to get people to think, and ultimately to be able to motivate action. As I've said, it is well researched, it is well written, it is well crafted. There's some really great stories and examples and insights that I think has a lot of value for helping to appreciate the challenge that we run into and the conflicts that we experience and what we need to do to be able to overcome those challenges. I personally can speak to it. It had a huge value for me on a personal level in terms of thinking about how I rethink and reinvent and recalibrate my perspective. Particularly, it's a great exploration in terms of who we are and where we're going and why we are actually going there. And in doing that, what I really appreciate, and I didn't really see this coming until the end, and I have absolute appreciation for how the book took a little bit of a right-hand turn, going from the individual to the interactive to ultimately the collective. At the end, Grant comes right back full circle to, well, what does this actually mean for us? And how do we tackle what is probably for each of us the biggest unlearning of all? Why do you do what you do? What are the factors that actually got you into the role, the job, the profession that you're in? Are you happy there? Do you have meaning there? Do you get value there? Do you enjoy and appreciate and look forward to the work you do? Are you frustrated? Are you disillusioned? Are you possibly wishing perhaps I should have taken a different path? Are you possibly regretting some of the choices that you didn't make along the way? And so some really interesting explorations about how they arrived, how each of us arrived, the place that we are, and then what do we do about that? Now, the challenge I have with the book is exactly that. It's about taking action and being able to do that. And it's the challenge of there is only so much that you can do in a work that is 250 pages long. This is a huge survey of being able to understand not just how we learn, but how we actually have to unlearn, how we let go, how we change minds, how we change mindsets. There's a story that he relates in the book. It's a story I'm familiar with. It's a story that I had heard about before, about a man by the name of Daryl Davis. Now, Davis is a musician. Davis is a black musician. Davis is a black musician that plays frequently and regularly in the southern United States. And as a result of that, Davis has also dealt with significant amounts of racism from a small boy all the way through his entire life. What makes Daryl Davis unique, though, is that he holds as friends a number of former members of the Ku Klux Klan. He is personally responsible for, at this point, about 200 KKK members rethinking their beliefs and their values and ultimately relinquishing their membership in that organization. In fact, one that he speaks of not only changed his mind in terms of his belief about black people and his belief about racism, but actually shut down the chapter. And later on, asked Davis to be the godparent of his daughter. Those are some high stakes conversations. And what's interesting is the book talks about the conversations and it talks about the stakes and it talks about how Davis approaches these conversations. And yet at the same time, I'm not sure I could replicate that. I'm not sure that I would have the confidence or the presence of mind or the clarity of how to be able to approach that conversation to actually be able to move towards a positive outcome of that significance. And that's where the work still lies in terms of being able to work through that, is that it's clear shifting mindsets are possible. It's clear that people that have been and have been raised to be racist all their lives can actually rethink and unlearn and be willing to reframe some of the values that they hold most dearly to their level of self-identity. It can be clear that Red Sox and Yankee fans, again, rapidly holding to a fundamental viewpoint that is, again, largely a product of their birth, can be brought to and encourage a rethinking of, does that make sense? Is that reasonable? Might I be irrational in terms of either that love for my team or the absolute hatred and loathing of the other team? And not to equate those two circumstances, but to be able to recognize that both of them are a product of similar thinking and similar experience and similar challenge in terms of unlearning. And each of us has our own challenges that we need to be able to go through. And so the question is, how do we do that? What Grant illustrates is it's possible to be able to do that. He points to strategies and perspectives. He does a wonderful job of linking to the actual research that reinforces not just the ability to be able to change, but what it takes to actually be able to do that. But there is more work and there's more research that each of us then needs to do to be able to take action on it. That said, would I recommend this as a book? I would heartily recommend it for its openness to change, for the mindsets required, for its value of scientific thinking and experimentation, of being able to recognize the traps that we find ourselves in, and also being able to recognize and appreciate the perspectives that can help us find a way out again. So my overall take is that Think Again by Adam Grant is an exceptionally valuable book. As I said, is the first book that I've reviewed here where I can absolutely unequivocally state my intention is to read it again, and my intention is to read it again very soon. Because for everything that I got out of it on the first read, having gone through the first read, it led me to shift my perspective again in terms of how much more there is to mine out of it. And that, in my view, is absolutely the recipe of an exceptional book. Thanks for joining us on Strategy Books. We'll be back with another episode soon. If you're interested in the books we talked about today, you can find links to them in the description below. Be sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed today's recording, please hit that like button as well in order to help others to be able to find the recording. Let me know what you got out of the book in the comments below, and comment as well if you have questions or ideas for a future book. Thanks again, we'll see you at another review soon.